In the distant reaches of space, far beyond the ruins of Earth, lies the last human colony, New Hope. This isolated outpost, nestled deep within the shadow of a barren star system, has become humanity's final refuge. Decades earlier, Earth fell, consumed in a devastating war against the Viethier, a technologically superior alien race. The Viethier swept through the galaxy, conquering planets and enslaving civilizations with brutal efficiency. Humanity, despite its resilience, could not withstand the relentless onslaught. The war was long and bloody, with entire cities reduced to rubble, and Earth's once great fleets decimated by Viethier ships that outgunned and outmaneuvered them at every turn. It wasn't just their technology that made the Viethier invincible, but their cold, unyielding strategy. They crushed rebellions before they could spark, targeting human command centers, communications, and infrastructure with surgical precision. Slowly but surely, the human race was driven from its homeworld, scattering into the farthest corners of the galaxy in a desperate bid for survival. Among the few surviving pockets of resistance, New Hope became the most important. Hidden far from the usual travel routes, this colony represented the last bastion of hope for those who escaped Earth's destruction. The colony's existence had been a well-kept secret for years, known only to a few in the highest echelons of human command. Though isolated and sparsely populated, New Hope remained a symbol of defiance, a place where the human spirit could live on, even if the rest of the galaxy had seemingly moved on from their plight. At the heart of New Hope's leadership stood General EVA Cortez, a woman shaped by the ravages of war. Born into a military family, EVA had known battle for most of her life. Her father had been a decorated officer in the Earth Defense Fleet, and from a young age, EVA followed in his footsteps. She was known for her sharp tactical mind, her ability to remain calm under pressure, and her willingness to take risks when the stakes were highest. These qualities helped her rise through the ranks during the war, where she commanded fleets against the Viethier's overwhelming forces. However, like all human leaders, she too faced bitter defeats, watching as Earth crumbled beneath the Viethier iron fist. When the order came to evacuate Earth, EVA was tasked with leading one of the last convoys to leave the planet's surface. The escape was perilous, with Viethier forces closing in on the few remaining evacuation ships, but through a mix of luck and sheer will, EVA's fleet managed to break through the Viethier blockade, leading her and the survivors to New Hope. It was there, in the colony's cold metallic corridors, that EVA found a new purpose: leading the remnants of humanity in their fight for survival. Years had passed since that harrowing escape, and in that time, EVA transformed New Hope into a functioning, though fragile, community. The colony was a far cry from the great cities of Earth, but it was enough to sustain the thousands of refugees who now called it home. Beneath the surface, however, cracks were beginning to show. Resources were running dangerously low, the crops grown in the colony's artificial farm had begun to fail, and the technology that kept the colony hidden from Viethier scanners was aging and prone to malfunction. Every day, the fear of discovery loomed larger. The people of New Hope were growing weary. Life in hiding, constantly looking over their shoulders, had taken its toll. Supplies that once seemed abundant were dwindling, and the colony's ability to produce food and energy was becoming less reliable. The Viethier presence in nearby sectors had increased, heightening the anxiety of the population. People whispered of betrayal, fearing that one wrong move could reveal their location. It was a fragile existence, and the pressure was mounting on EVA to find a solution before it was too late. Among the colonists, a sense of hopelessness was beginning to set in. Many had lost family members to the war, and the thought of living out the rest of their days in a hidden corner of the galaxy, constantly under threat of annihilation, weighed heavily on them. Factions began to emerge within the colony, some advocating for aggressive action against the Viethier, while others argued for seeking peace, however unlikely that seemed. EVA knew that neither option would be easy. Direct conflict with the Viethier meant certain death, but living in hiding forever was no way to exist either. The clock was ticking, and something had to give. Despite the growing unrest, EVA remained steadfast. She had not fought so hard, had not lost so many friends and comrades, to give up now. In her eyes, there was still a glimmer of hope, a chance, however slim, that humanity could not only survive, but strike back against the Viethier. It would require meticulous planning, immense sacrifice, and a boldness that few would dare to attempt. But Evie was no stranger to boldness. She had stared down death before, and she was prepared to do it again if it meant giving humanity a fighting chance. As she stood in her command center, gazing at the holographic map of New Hope and the surrounding sectors, EVA felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. Every decision she made could mean the difference between life and death for the thousands under her protection. But she also knew that the Vithier were not invincible. They had weaknesses, just as any empire did, and she was determined to exploit them. The colony's survival, and perhaps the survival of the entire human race, depended on it. For now, New Hope remained hidden, but it was only a matter of time before the Vithier would find them. And when that day came, Eva Cortez would be ready. And so, with the last of humanity under her command, she prepared for the inevitable. Without warning, the Vithier's relentless surveillance systems picked up traces of New Hope. Despite the colony's best efforts to remain hidden, the advanced alien technology had finally pierced through their defenses. It began with a faint energy signal, barely noticeable in the vastness of space, but it was enough to trigger the Vithier's suspicion. For years, the Vithier had methodically scoured the galaxy, hunting down the last remnants of humanity. They had all but given up hope of finding another human stronghold when this faint trace appeared on their scanners. Immediately, a massive fleet was dispatched to investigate, led by the Vithier's most ruthless commander. The humans had no idea they had been discovered. Life continued as usual in the colony, with citizens performing their daily tasks in a fragile semblance of normalcy. They had no reason to suspect that the end was near. The colony's detection systems, old and in desperate need of repair, failed to pick up the approaching Vithier fleet until it was too late. The Vithier moved swiftly and silently, slipping through the shadows of the system's outer planets, positioning themselves for a decisive strike. Then, in a flash of light and fire, the Vithier made their presence known. The skies above New Hope erupted as their massive warships appeared in orbit, blotting out the stars. These were not just simple attack vessels. Each Vithier ship was a fortress, bristling with advanced weaponry and shields that made them nearly impervious to counterattacks. Within moments, the first wave of the invasion began. The colony's defense systems, cobbled together from whatever technology the humans had managed to salvage, were no match for the Vithier's firepower. The initial barrage struck with terrifying precision, knocking out key communications hubs and power grids. The ground trembled as explosions rocked the colony, sending debris flying through the air. Panic spread like wildfire among the population as they scrambled to find shelter from the relentless bombardment. Civilians, who had never seen combat, found themselves caught in the middle of a war they had hoped to avoid. In the colony's command center, alarms blared and chaos reigned. Desperate messages flooded in from every corner of New Hope, reporting fires, structural collapses, and mounting casualties. The human defense forces, though brave, were woefully underprepared for an invasion of this scale. Their ships, smaller and older than the Vithier's, took heavy losses in the opening minutes of the battle. Pilots barely had time to launch before they were blown out of the sky by Vithier lasers. On the ground, the colony's defense turrets fired in a futile attempt to slow the advancing alien forces, but their efforts were in vain. The sheer number of Vithier ships seemed endless, and the humans were being systematically overwhelmed. Amid the destruction, General Eva Cortez remained a pillar of strength in the face of almost certain defeat. She did not waver. Years of experience had prepared her for this moment. She knew full well that New Hope could not win a head-to-head confrontation with the Vithier. They lacked the firepower, the numbers, and the technology to hold their own in a conventional fight. But Eva was not one to surrender easily. If the colony was to survive, they would need to outthink the Vithier. She immediately ordered a retreat of the remaining ships, pulling them back to defensive positions closer to the surface, where the colony's shields might offer some protection. EVA moved swiftly to reorganize the defense forces, using the colony's underground communication networks to issue new orders to the remaining pilots and ground troops. The plan was simple: hit and run. Rather than engage the Vithier directly, the humans would strike at key targets, sabotage the enemy's supply lines, and use the colony's natural terrain to their advantage. It wasn't about winning the battle, it was about buying time. Every second the humans could delay the Vithier advance was another second they could use to regroup and evacuate civilians to safer areas. Eva's strategy centered around guerrilla tactics, a style of warfare the Vithier were unaccustomed to. The Vithier's strength lay in their overwhelming power, but they were slow to adapt when faced with unconventional resistance. Human strike teams, small and agile, were dispatched to target vulnerable points in the Vithier forces. Infiltration units, armed with explosives and EMP devices, were tasked with disabling Vithier weapon systems and sabotaging their supply depots. It was dangerous work, and many of the teams were comprised of volunteers who knew they might not return. But the colonists were determined to defend their home no matter the cost. The first wave of counterattacks had some success. A Vithier supply ship was destroyed in a surprise raid, and several key weapons platforms were disabled by human saboteurs. These small victories, though insignificant in the grand scheme of things, gave the people of New Hope a glimmer of hope. For a brief moment, the VTR advance slowed as they regrouped to assess the new threat. But EVA knew this was only the beginning. The VTR would adapt, and when they did, they would come back stronger and more determined than ever. As the VTR tightened their grip around the colony, EVA began to prepare for the next phase of her plan. She understood that the humans couldn't hold out forever, but if they could keep the VTR distracted long enough, there might still be a chance to evacuate some of the population. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. EVA remained calm, her focus never wavering from the task at hand. She had seen countless battles before this, and while the odds were daunting, she knew that victory wasn't always measured in battles won. Sometimes, survival itself was the victory. In the hours that followed, the battle raged on. The VTR bombardment intensified, but the human resistance refused to be crushed. Strike after strike, they harassed the VTR forces, retreating into the shadows before the enemy could retaliate. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse, with both sides suffering heavy losses. As the day wore on, Eva's leadership became the glue holding the colony together. She inspired her troops to keep fighting, to push forward, even when the situation seemed hopeless. The VTR invasion had begun, and the battle for New Hope was far from over. EVA Cortez knew that a direct confrontation with the VTR was suicide, so she adapted to what humanity had always excelled at, fighting with intelligence rather than brute force. With her troops outgunned and the colony under siege, the only way to hold out was to turn the very terrain and resources of New Hope into weapons. Small strike teams, handpicked for their experience and loyalty, began executing high-risk missions. These teams infiltrated VTR ships and outposts under the cover of darkness, using their intimate knowledge of the colony's topography to avoid detection. Their approach was simple: attack where the enemy was least expecting. They laid traps along key VTR supply routes, using homemade explosives and EMP devices to disable the alien technology. One team managed to plant charges on a VTR dropship, destroying it before it could deploy reinforcements. Another successfully hacked into the enemy's communication channels, relaying false orders and causing confusion among the VTR ranks. The humans also took advantage of the VTR's reliance on their advanced tech by jamming their scanners with makeshift devices, allowing the resistance fighters to move undetected. These tactics were not just inspired by modern warfare, but by strategies that had worked for centuries. EVA studied the guerrilla movements from Earth's past revolutions where smaller, less equipped forces had used their environment and unconventional methods to disrupt much larger armies. The human fighters moved like shadows, striking quickly and disappearing before the VTR could mount a counterattack. It was a war of attrition, and for every VTR ship disabled or weapons depot destroyed, the humans bought themselves precious time. While these victories gave the colonists a glimmer of hope, the VTR were not a race to be outmaneuvered easily. As their forces began suffering losses and disruptions, they responded with characteristic brutality. More warships descended on New Hope, filling the skies with ominous silhouettes that blotted out the sun. The VTR answer to the guerrilla tactics was overwhelming firepower. They targeted areas suspected of harboring human strike teams, unleashing wave after wave of precision strikes that obliterated entire sections of the colony's infrastructure. Buildings crumbled under the sheer force of the VTR bombardment, and civilian casualties mounted. To the VTR, it was a calculated response. Their goal was to crush resistance through fear and absolute domination, hoping that the humans would eventually break under the strain. However, despite the devastation, the human fighters continued their operations. If anything, the brutality of the VTR's response only steeled their resolve. In some instances, the VTR's superior technology began to work against them. Their reliance on automated systems and advanced AI left them vulnerable to human sabotage efforts. When a key VTR command ship suffered a power outage caused by a small human strike team, the resulting chaos allowed the colony's remaining defense forces to regroup and launch another series of strikes. Still, it was a brutal and costly battle. Each mission undertaken by the resistance was filled with danger, and the human forces, though effective, were stretched thin. Every successful sabotage operation came at a price. Many never returned from their missions, and the colony was losing some of its best fighters to the war of attrition. The VTR, despite their setbacks, were relentless. Their reinforcements arrived with increasing frequency, tightening the noose around New Hope. Inside the colony, tensions grew as the battle dragged on. The morale of the civilian population began to falter. The constant threat of bombardment and the increasing casualties among their friends and family led many to question whether resistance was even possible. Arguments broke out in the underground bunkers where civilians huddled for safety. Some believed that surrendering to the Vethier might be the only way to save what was left of their home. Others argued that fighting was the only option, even if it meant death. Eva understood these fears, but couldn't allow them to divide the colony. Her leadership had to be more than just military strategy, it had to inspire the people to keep going. She gathered her officers and key figures in the community, working tirelessly to maintain unity in the face of overwhelming odds. In her private moments, she too felt the weight of the situation. The casualties were mounting, and the Vethier showed no signs of relenting. But she had a plan, one that she kept close to her chest. It was risky, but if executed properly, it could turn the tide of the battle. For now, she needed to keep her people fighting, keep them believing that victory, however distant, was still possible. In secret meetings with her top officers, EVA began laying the groundwork for the next phase of the resistance. She knew the current guerrilla tactics would not hold off the Vethier indefinitely. They needed something bigger, something decisive. The sabotage operations had slowed the Vethier advance, but not enough to guarantee the colony's survival. She hinted at her plan carefully, keeping the details vague for now, knowing that morale was a fragile thing. If the people knew how dangerous her plan was, they might lose hope altogether. But for now, the fight continued. Each small victory gave the colony a few more hours, maybe a few more days. The Vethier were growing frustrated by the resistance, and their heavy-handed tactics were beginning to show cracks in their strategy. However, the human fighters knew the Vethier would soon adapt, and when they did, they would come back even stronger. The only question that remained was whether the resistance could adapt faster and whether Eva's secret plan would be ready in time. The strain on the colony grew each day, but so did the determination of its people. The longer they fought, the more they realized that surrender was not an option. They had already lost so much families, homes, their planet. Now all that remained was their will to survive, and under EVA Cortez's leadership, that will was stronger than ever. The resistance's strikes, while seemingly small in the grand scheme of the Vethier Empire, carried a message that was clear: humanity would not go quietly into the night. They would fight, even if the odds were impossible. They would resist, even if it meant sacrificing everything. And with each blow they struck against the Vethier, they bought themselves just a little more time for whatever plan EVA was preparing to unfold. The resistance had fought bravely for days, delaying the inevitable with guerrilla tactics, but the Vethier were tightening their grip. As the colony crumbled under the relentless bombardment, General EVA Cortez knew they were running out of time. It was in the midst of this growing desperation that she revealed her final plan, a move so audacious that even her most seasoned fighters were stunned. The plan, she explained, was a suicide mission. They would steal one of the Vethier's own capital ships. EVA had always been a master tactician, but this plan was unlike anything they had ever attempted. It wasn't enough to continue with sabotage, they needed something that would shift the balance in their favor. The Vethier ships were enormous, heavily armed, and nearly impossible to infiltrate. But Eva's plan wasn't just about sneaking aboard. They would hack into the ship's systems, wrest control from the Vethier, and turn the warship's weapons against its own fleet. Once they had the ship under their command, they would use it to break through the blockade that surrounded New Hope and give the remaining survivors a chance to escape. The room fell silent as she outlined the details. No one had ever dared to suggest such a thing before. Some of the officers exchanged glances, their faces etched with uncertainty. The risks were obvious. A single misstep would mean certain death, not just for the strike team, but for everyone in the colony. The Vethier ships were heavily fortified, and even if they managed to breach the hull, they would have to fight their way through waves of Vethier soldiers to reach the control room. But Eva's resolve was unshakable. She made it clear that this was their only chance. The longer they stayed pinned down, the more likely it was that the Vethier would discover and destroy the colony. There was no room for hesitation. The mission had to go forward. Only a handful of fighters volunteered to join Eva on the mission. These were her most trusted comrades, the elite of the resistance, who had fought alongside her in the darkest moments of the war. They knew the stakes and were willing to sacrifice everything to give humanity a fighting chance. With the plan set in motion, there was no turning back. The mission began with a daring maneuver. Using the wreckage of a destroyed human vessel, EVA and her team cloaked their small transport ship and drifted undetected toward the Vethier capital ship, which loomed ominously in the distance. It was the largest in the Vethier fleet, a symbol of their dominance, with weapons powerful enough to obliterate an entire planet. The team remained silent, knowing that one mistake could alert the Veethier to their presence. As they approached the ship, they initiated a hack on its docking system, forcing open a small airlock. It was a dangerous move, but they had no other choice. Once inside, the team moved swiftly through the dark, sterile corridors of the ship. Every step was calculated, every breath measured. They knew they had limited time before the Veethier realized there were intruders on board. The ship's layout had been studied meticulously in the days leading up to the mission, but even with that knowledge, navigating the Veethier technology was no easy task. Their goal was to reach the central control room, located deep within the ship's core, and initiate a full-scale cyber attack that would give them command of the ship's systems. As they advanced, the team encountered resistance. Veethier soldiers, tall and menacing in their black armor, patrolled the ship's halls. The humans engaged them in brief, fierce skirmishes, using their knowledge of the Veethier's weaknesses to gain the upper hand. Despite being outnumbered, they pushed forward, taking down guards with swift precision. The tension grew as they neared their objective. The sound of alarms began to echo through the corridors, signaling that their presence had been detected. There was no time to waste. Reaching the control room, EVA and her team encountered the heaviest resistance yet. Veethier commandos were stationed at the entrance, and the ensuing battle was brutal. The human fighters fought with everything they had, knowing this was their only chance. Bullets and energy blasts flew through the air as the two sides clashed in a chaotic, violent struggle. Several of Eva's team were wounded, but they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that failure meant the end for everyone they had sworn to protect. Once inside the control room, the real battle began. Eva's team worked quickly, hacking into the ship's central systems while fending off Veethier reinforcements. It was a race against time. The ship's AI fought back, trying to lock them out of key systems, but the humans were prepared. They had developed a virus specifically designed to override Veethier tech, and after several tense minutes, they succeeded. The ship's systems came online, under their control. For a brief moment, there was a stunned silence as they realized what they had just accomplished. But the mission was far from over. EVA immediately ordered the ship's weapons to be turned on the rest of the Veethier fleet. Massive energy cannons, once pointed at the colony, were now aimed at the Veethier warships. The surprise attack took the Veethier by complete surprise. One by one, their ships were decimated by the firepower of their own capital ship. Explosions lit up the sky as the Veethier fleet was torn apart. The humans had turned the tide. As the Veethier forces scrambled to regroup, EVA knew they had only bought themselves a brief window of time. She ordered the evacuation of New Hope, giving the colonists a chance to escape while the Veethier were reeling from the surprise attack. The Veethier had been stunned, but they would return in greater numbers. For now, though, the colony had survived, and the human resistance had delivered a blow that the Veethier wouldn't soon forget. As EVA and her remaining team prepared to leave the ship, she took one last look at the destruction they had caused. The mission had been a success, but it had come at a great cost. Many of her fighters had fallen, and the battle for humanity was far from over. But for the first time in years, there was a glimmer of hope. The Veethier had underestimated humanity's resilience, and that mistake would haunt them for a long time. The battle was over, but the scars it left on New Hope were unmistakable. As the survivors gathered in the aftermath, the reality of what had transpired began to sink in. Debris littered the streets, remnants of buildings that had once been homes now reduced to smoldering ruins. The acrid smell of smoke hung in the air, mingling with the silence of a population that had narrowly escaped annihilation. The price of survival had been steep, with countless lives lost in the chaos of the Veethier invasion. Their friends, family members, and comrades who had fought valiantly were now gone, leaving a void that weighed heavily on those who remained. For the first time since the war had begun, however, there was something more than just grief among the people. As they looked toward the sky, where the Veethier fleet had once dominated, they realized that, against all odds, they had struck back. The Veethier had come to crush them, to wipe out the last remnants of humanity, but instead, they had been forced to retreat. The sight of the enemy's burning warships, still smoldering from the unexpected assault, served as a stark reminder that the resistance had made its mark. It was a victory, however small, that reignited a spark of hope. Survivors shared their stories, some with haunted eyes recounting the fierce battles fought in the corridors of the colony, or the sabotage missions that had claimed the lives of so many. There was no denying the pain that lingered, but in every conversation, a common thread emerged: the sense that humanity was not yet defeated. They had proven that they could fight back, even when outgunned, outnumbered, and nearly overwhelmed. This battle had shown them that the Viethier were not invincible. They could be hurt, and that knowledge was more valuable than any weapon they had wielded in the fight. As the colonists tended to their wounded and mourned their dead, they also began to rebuild, knowing that time was not on their side. The Viethier had been stunned, but they would regroup, and when they returned, they would do so with greater force. There was no time to celebrate. Supplies were scarce, defenses had been crippled, and the damage to the colony's infrastructure was extensive. Yet there was a renewed sense of purpose among the people. They had weathered the storm, and now they would have to prepare for the next one. Amid the rebuilding efforts, General Eva Cortez stood apart from the crowd, lost in thought. The battle had taken its toll on her as well, though she would never admit it to her troops. She had led them through one of the darkest moments in human history, and yet she knew this was only the beginning. The Viethier would return, and when they did, they would not be as easily caught off guard. This was not a war that would be won in a single battle, or even 100. It would be a long, grueling fight for survival, one that would demand more from her and her people than ever before. Eva's mind raced through the events of the past few days. The daring mission to steal the Viethier warship had been a gamble, one that had paid off, but it had also shown her just how thin the line was between victory and defeat. Had they failed, there would be no survivors to regroup. As she stared out at the shattered colony, she thought of the lives lost in the mission, the sacrifices made by those who had never hesitated to follow her into battle. Their courage had been the key to their success, but the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her shoulders. How many more would she have to lead to their deaths before this war was over? Despite the heavy losses, Eva's resolve hardened. The Viethier had underestimated humanity, and that mistake had cost them. But they would not make the same mistake twice. The next time they came, they would be prepared for a fight, and new hope would need to be stronger than ever. Eva knew that their survival depended on more than just military strategy. They needed alliances, resources, and a way to strike at the Viethier core. If they could continue to disrupt the Viethier's operations, chip away at their forces, and find a way to weaken their grip on the galaxy, there might still be a chance to turn the tide. But time was running out. The resistance needed to act quickly before the Viethier could regroup and strike back with full force. Eva's mind was already moving beyond the battle, thinking of the next step, the next target. They couldn't just wait for the Viethier to return, they needed to go on the offensive, to take the fight to the enemy before they had a chance to recover. It was a bold move, but Eva had always believed that victory favored the bold. As the sun began to set over the battered colony, casting long shadows across the debris-strewn streets, Eva felt a familiar sensation in her chest, a quiet, burning determination. She would not let the Viethier extinguish the flame of humanity. Not now, not ever. There was still so much to fight for. They had come too far, sacrificed too much, to let it end here. Even as she stood there contemplating their next move, Eva knew that the Viethier were already planning their return. This was only the beginning, a small taste of the larger conflict to come. The war was far from over, and the future of New Hope was uncertain. But one thing was clear: humanity would continue to resist, no matter the cost. In the silence of the twilight, Eva's gaze lifted to the stars, where the remnants of the Viethier fleet still flickered in the distance. There was no time for rest. The battle may have ended, but the war for humanity's survival had just begun. With that thought, she turned and walked back into the heart of the colony, ready to face whatever came next. The fight was far from over, and the next battle was already on the horizon.